If we were to place a magnifying glass over the long arc of human history, slowly tracing centuries of conquest, bloodshed, and collapse, an unsettling pattern would begin to reveal itself. The greatest wars are rarely born from chaos or spontaneous madness. They are not accidents, they are systems, carefully constructed, patiently financed, and deliberately sustained. History textbooks prefer simpler explanations. They tell us wars are fought for freedom, for honor, for faith, for national survival. They frame conflict as a moral struggle between good and evil, liberty and tyranny. But those stories are designed to comfort, not to explain. They are the language of mobilization, not the language of truth. Beneath the speeches, beneath the flags and the patriotic songs, there is almost always a quieter force at work, one that does not care about ideology or sacrifice, a force that measures success not in territory gained or lives lost, but in balances, margins, and returns. That force is money. A war fought purely for moral principles, completely detached from financial interest, is almost non-existent in modern history when the rhetoric is stripped away, when the emotional framing is peeled back layer by layer. The rhythm of war reveals itself. The drums do not beat randomly, they beat in time with debt, credit, and profit. You do not need to travel back to ancient empires to see this mechanism in action. The blueprint for modern economic warfare, the kind where nations bleed while financial institutions grow stronger, was drafted, signed, and executed just over a century ago. During the catastrophe we now call the First World War, consider the sheer scale of that conflict. What began as a European power struggle spiraled into an industrial slaughter unlike anything the world had seen before. Entire regions were reduced to rubble. Monarchies that had ruled for centuries collapsed. Borders were redrawn by force. A generation was permanently scarred, both physically and psychologically. Millions die. Millions more returned home broken only to face ruined economies, shattered currencies, and societies struggling to survive the aftermath. Yet when the smoke finally cleared, when the treaties were signed and the mass graves filled, one group emerged from the ruins not weakened, not exhausted, but vastly more powerful than before. It was not the victorious governments, it was not the citizens who endured rationing and loss, and it was certainly not the soldiers who fought and died. The true victors of the First World War were the banks. This claim often sounds like cynicism. To some, it borders on conspiracy. But it is neither speculation nor modern revisionism. It is a conclusion supported by official investigations, documented evidence, and admissions buried deep within the archives of the United States government itself, years after the war. As the illusions faded and economic hardship replaced patriotic glory, uncomfortable questions began to surface, and once those questions were asked publicly, they could no longer be ignored. That moment when the financial foundations of the war were finally examined is where the hidden history truly begins. By the early 1930s, the glow of victory from the First World War had completely evaporated. The parades were long over. The speeches about honor and sacrifice rang hollow. The United States was now deep in the grip of the Great Depression, and for millions of Americans, the question was no longer who won the war, but why their lives had fallen apart afterward. Banks were collapsing, jobs had vanished, savings were wiped out overnight, and as desperation spread, the public began asking questions that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. If the war had been fought to defend democracy and prosperity, why did so few seem to benefit from it? And why did the same financial institutions that had thrived during the war now hold such immense power over a broken economy? Under this pressure, the U.S. government was forced to act. In 1934, the United States Senate authorized a special investigative committee to examine the financial interests behind America's entry into the First World War. Officially, it was known as the Senate Committee on the Investigation of the Munitions Industry. History remembers it by a simpler name, the Nye Committee, after its chairman, Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota. This was not a symbolic inquiry. it was not a publicity stunt. For nearly 2 years, the committee issued subpoenas, seized private correspondence, and compelled testimony from some of the most powerful figures in American finance and industry. Executives from major banks, leaders of arms manufacturers, representatives of Wall Street firms whose influence had quietly expanded during the war years. What the committee uncovered was deeply unsettling. They found extensive evidence that American banks and arms manufacturers had aggressively lobbied against neutrality, that financial institutions had arranged massive loans to foreign governments long before the United States officially entered the conflict, that profits from weapons, ammunition, and supplies had soared while political leaders publicly claimed moral detachment from the war raging in Europe. Even more troubling was the pattern that began to emerge. Decisions presented to the public as matters of national security increasingly appeared to align perfectly with private financial interests. Arms embargoes were opposed not because they threatened peace, but because they threatened revenue. Risk was not eliminated, it was transferred, shifted away from private balance sheets and toward the public. The deeper the committee dug, the clearer the picture became. The road to war had not been paved by a single assassination or a sudden moral awakening. It had been laid brick by brick through contracts, loans, and calculated exposure to financial collapse. But just as the investigation began approaching the highest levels of political and financial power, something changed. Funding for the committee was reduced, political pressure intensified. The investigation was branded as unpatriotic, anti-business, even dangerous in a world once again drifting toward global conflict. Witnesses became harder to reach. Momentum stalled before the committee could issue a final, comprehensive indictment. It was effectively shut down. Its most explosive findings were never fully pursued. Its conclusions were quietly buried beneath the rising tensions of the late 1930s. And once the world's attention shifted toward the looming Second World War, the uncomfortable lessons of the first were pushed aside. The banks had survived scrutiny, their profits were secured, and history moved on without resolving the question at its core. But, to understand how this situation came to exist in the first place, you need to rewind even further. Before investigations, before propaganda, before America fired a single shot, we need to re-examine the story we think we know about the origins of the war itself. Ask almost anyone what started the First World War, and you will likely hear the same answer: the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And on the surface, that answer is correct. The gunshots fired in June of 1914 were the immediate trigger. They were the spark that set events in motion. But a spark alone does not cause an explosion. A match thrown into empty air produces nothing. For a detonation to occur, combustible material must already be present, collected, stored, and arranged over time. World wars do not erupt spontaneously. They are not emotional outbursts of history. They are industrial-scale projects, and like all industrial projects, they require years of preparation, coordination, and above all, financing. The assassination in Sarajevo provided a convenient narrative, a clean starting point for history books, but it did not explain why the war expanded so rapidly, why it lasted so long, or why nations far removed from the original conflict, most notably the United States, were eventually pulled into its gravitational field. By the time the first shots were fired, the fundamental beneficiaries of the coming war had already been identified. They were not soldiers, they were not citizens, they were not even governments. They were a small, tightly connected network of international financiers, centered around New York and London, with deep historical ties to European banking dynasties. At the center of this network stood the House of Morgan. To understand America's eventual entry into the war, we must look carefully at the timeline. When hostilities erupted in 1914, the United States declared itself neutral. President Woodrow Wilson made it clear that America would avoid entanglement in European conflicts. The American public overwhelmingly supported this position. Isolationism was not a fringe belief, it was the national consensus. The images coming out of Europe were horrifying: endless trenches, industrial slaughter, entire landscapes reduced to mud and corpses. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with it. But, while the American military stayed home, American capital did not. From the earliest days of the war, money began flowing across the Atlantic. Britain and France, locked in an existential struggle, urgently needed food, weapons, raw materials, and industrial output on a scale they could no longer sustain themselves. Their factories were overstretched, their labor forces were depleted, and their treasuries were draining fast, so they turned to the United States. American factories supplied rifles, artillery shells, uniforms, chemicals, steel, grain, and fuel. But there was a problem. The Allied governments did not have the cash to pay for these goods up front. Their gold reserves were finite, their currencies were under pressure, and the war showed no signs of ending quickly. The solution was borrowing, massive borrowing. American banks stepped in, extending enormous lines of credit to Britain and France so they could continue purchasing American goods. On paper, this appeared to be neutral commerce. In reality, it was the first step in a much deeper financial entanglement. As the war dragged on and Germany continued to press the Allies on the battlefield, a dangerous realization began to spread through the financial centers of New York. By late 1915 and early 1916, American banks had loaned billions of dollars to governments whose survival was far from guaranteed. If Britain and France lost the war, their governments could collapse. If their governments collapsed, their debts would default, and if those debts defaulted, the American financial system itself would face catastrophic losses. At that moment, neutrality stopped being a virtue. It became a liability. The fate of American banks was now directly tied to the outcome of a foreign war, and once that connection was made, the question was no longer whether the United States could remain neutral, but how long neutrality could be sustained without financial disaster. To understand how this risk transformed into political pressure, we first need to examine the mechanics of war financing itself, how nations actually pay for wars when the costs spiral beyond imagination. And when a nation enters a large-scale war, the financial challenge it faces is immediate and overwhelming. Wars are not paid for like normal government programs. There is no surplus budget waiting to be tapped. No simple transaction that covers the costs. A war economy requires the entire financial system to be rewired in real time. The first step is always internal reallocation. Governments begin by cutting or freezing domestic spending. Funds are pulled from education, infrastructure, housing, and social services and redirected toward military production. Civilian priorities are quietly downgraded in the name of national survival, but even this drastic shift barely makes a dent when a war stretches across continents and consumes resources at an industrial scale. Next comes taxation. Taxes are raised across the board. New taxes are introduced. Existing ones are increased. The population is squeezed to extract as much revenue as politically possible. But taxation has limits. Pushed too hard, and social unrest follows. At a certain point, governments hit a wall when taxes can no longer rise. The next tool is money creation. Currencies are expanded. New money is printed to pay suppliers and service debt. This process rarely comes with an explicit announcement of consequences, but the result is predictable. Inflation rises. Purchasing power falls, while it does not look like a tax on paper. Inflation quietly strips value from every paycheck and every savings account. It is taxation. Without legislation, then comes domestic borrowing. War bonds are issued, wrapped in patriotic language, and sold directly to citizens. People are urged to lend their savings to the government as a moral duty. Posters appear. Celebrities endorse the effort. Refusal is framed as disloyalty. Yet even with mass participation, war bonds alone cannot sustain a conflict on the scale of the First World War. Eventually, governments turned to their last internal reserve, gold. In the early 20th century, gold was not symbolic wealth, it was the foundation of money itself. Under the gold standard, a nation's ability to issue currency and credit was directly tied to the gold held in its vaults. As war expenses mounted, those reserves were drained rapidly, and once the gold was gone, a nation faced a stark reality. It had only one option left. It had to turn outward. At that moment, sovereignty begins to dissolve. A government that can no longer finance itself internally must beg for loans from foreign creditors. Its survival becomes dependent not on its people, but on the confidence of bankers beyond its borders. Policy choices narrow. Independence erodes. Financial control replaces political control. This was the moment when J.P. Morgan entered the war not with troops, but with contracts. To understand the scale of influence Morgan wielded, we need to strip away modern assumptions about banking today. Banks are places where individuals store money or take out mortgages. In the early 20th century, the House of Morgan was something entirely different. It was a financial empire that functioned as a parallel authority within the United States. In some respects, it possessed more immediate economic power than the federal government itself. J.P. Morgan was not merely a banker, he was the central node of Atlantic finance, the gatekeeper through which capital flowed between the old world and the new. When the war began, the British government faced a logistical nightmare. It needed to purchase enormous quantities of American goods from thousands of factories spread across the country. Managing those purchases individually was impossible. They needed a single intermediary, a coordinator, a financial command center. They chose J.P. Morgan. The agreement that followed was unprecedented. The House of Morgan was designated as the sole purchasing agent for Britain and later France. In the United States, every major Allied order flowed through Morgan's offices: uniforms, ammunition, chemicals, steel, food, raw materials, all of it passed through a single financial funnel. The implications were enormous. Morgan earned commissions on every transaction across millions of tons of goods, but the commissions were only the surface profit. The true power lay beneath, in the financing structure that supported the entire operation. To see how that structure worked hand-wide created a financial trap from which neutrality could no longer escape. We need to examine the loan system Morgan built around the war. The commission J.P. Morgan earned as the Allies' purchasing agent was substantial, but it was insignificant compared to the structure he built behind the scenes. The real profits of the war were not made by selling goods. They were made by financing the sale of those goods. Britain and France did not have the cash to pay for the mountains of supplies they were ordering from American factories. So Morgan did what no government could do alone. He organized credit on an unprecedented scale. The House of Morgan assembled syndicates of American banks to lend vast sums of money to the British and French governments. These loans were framed as temporary measures, short-term bridges until victory. In reality, they became the backbone of the Allied war effort. But here is the crucial detail. The money rarely left the United States. Instead of shipping gold or cash across the Atlantic, the borrowed funds were deposited into Allied accounts held at Morgan-controlled banks in New York. British and French purchasing agents then used that borrowed money to pay American manufacturers for weapons, steel, food, and industrial materials. Those manufacturers, in turn, deposited their earnings back into American banks, often the same banks participating in Morgan syndicates. Many were long-standing clients of the Morgan network. Some were partially owned or financially dependent on it. The result was a closed loop. American banks lent money to foreign governments. Those governments used the loans to buy American goods. The money flowed back into American industry and finance. The goods were shipped to Europe to be destroyed. The capital stayed in the United States. The debt stayed in Europe. This system generated profit at every stage. Banks earned interest on the loans. Morgan earned fees for arranging them. Industrial corporations enjoy guaranteed demand at massive scale. The risk, however, accumulated silently, because all of this depended on one assumption: the Allies had to win. If Britain or France collapsed, the loans would default. Billions of dollars would evaporate from American balance sheets. What had begun as profitable neutrality was turning into extreme exposure. After the death of J.P. Morgan Sr. in 1913, leadership passed to his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., often called Jack Morgan. Less theatrical than his father, he proved even more effective. Under his direction, the Morgan network extended its reach across roughly 2,200 banks and financial institutions. By the time the United States officially entered the war, Morgan-led syndicates had already facilitated approximately $1.5 billion in loans to the Allies. To understand the scale of this number, context matters. In 1914, the term billionaire barely existed. John D. Rockefeller would not officially reach that threshold until 1916. $1 billion was not just large, it was almost unimaginable, exceeding the total valuation of entire nations. And yet this level of capital was being mobilized to fuel a foreign war. The economic impact inside the United States was immediate and dramatic. Between 1914 and 1916, while Europe led, the American economy surged. A pre-war recession vanished. Factories expanded and ran day and night. Farmers increased production to feed distant armies. Unemployment fell sharply. The United States did not experience the war as devastation. It experienced it as a boom. Prosperity became dependent on conflict. Wages, profits, and bank solvency were now directly linked to the continuation of the war overseas. Peace was no longer an economic goal. It was a threat. If the war ended suddenly, orders would stop. Factories would shut down. The boom would collapse. Worse still, if Germany won, the debts propping up this entire system would become worthless. By late 1916, the United States was trapped. But the trap was not military, it was financial, and it was about to force a decision that neutrality could no longer postpone. By the end of 1916, the financial machinery powering the war was beginning to strain. The conflict had consumed far more resources than anyone had anticipated, and Britain and France were approaching the limits of what they could pledge as collateral. Their gold reserves were nearly exhausted. Shipments of bullion had already crossed the Atlantic in enormous quantities. Foreign investments had been sold off. Credit lines were stretched thin. The Allies were running out of options. For J.P. Morgan and the American banking syndicate, this created a nightmare scenario. If Britain and France could no longer borrow, they could no longer buy. If they could no longer buy, American factories would grind to a halt, and if the Allies collapsed on the battlefield, the billions of dollars already lent would become uncollectible overnight. This was the looming crisis of 1917, the very neutrality that had allowed American banks to profit without risk was now endangering the entire system. Private lenders had reached the point where they could not safely extend more credit. The war needed a new source of funding, one large enough to absorb the risk and guarantee repayment. That source was the United States government, but there was a problem. The U.S. Treasury could not legally lend massive sums to foreign belligerents while remaining neutral. The Constitution, public opinion, and political reality all stood in the way. As long as America stayed out of the war, Wall Street remained exposed. The solution was not financial. It was political. The risk had to be transferred from private balance sheets to the public ledger, from banks to taxpayers, from Wall Street to the American people. And the only mechanism capable of accomplishing that transfer was official entry into the war. This placed President Woodrow Wilson in an impossible position. Wilson had just won re-election in 1916 on a single defining promise: he kept us out of war. The slogan captured the mood of the nation. Americans did not want to fight. They did not see Europe's war as their own. Farmers in the Midwest and workers in the South had no desire to send their sons to die in foreign trenches. But Wilson was not operating in a vacuum. behind the scenes. Pressure was mounting from the financial elite and political power brokers who understood the stakes. They knew neutrality was no longer sustainable, not because of moral concerns, but because of financial exposure. The banks had made their bet, and now they needed the state to guarantee it. The message to Wilson was implicit but unmistakable. Publicly, he could run as the candidate of peace. Privately, he was warned that the economic structure supporting American prosperity was on the verge of collapse. Neutrality, once a shield, had become a liability. What remained was the problem of public consent. A democracy cannot enter a total war without a justification the public will accept. Financial necessity is not a rallying cry. Balance sheets do not inspire sacrifice. For the transition from peace to war to succeed, the narrative had to change. The opportunity for that change arrived in the form of a single intercepted message. America's formal entry into the war in April 1917 solved a problem that had haunted Wall Street for months. Once the United States became a belligerent, the legal and political barriers to massive state lending vanished overnight. What private banks could no longer safely do, the federal government now did at scale. The mechanism was elegant and devastating. Rather than directly taxing the population to finance the war, the U.S. government issued Liberty bonds. On paper, they were framed as patriotic investments. In reality, they were instruments designed to absorb private financial risk and relocate it onto the public balance sheet. Citizens were not merely encouraged to buy them, they were pressured. Bond drives became national rituals. Celebrities endorsed them. Employers organized compulsory voluntary purchases. School children were enlisted to shame adults who refused. Buying bonds was equated with loyalty. Abstaining was framed as treason. The money flowed in, but the critical detail was not who bought the bonds, it was where the money went. The proceeds from Liberty bonds did not primarily fund soldiers' pay or veterans' care. They flowed through the Treasury and into the same financial channels that had already extended credit to Britain and France. Existing loans were refinanced, new credits were issued, old risks were neutralized, private exposure was erased. The banks that had once faced catastrophic losses now held government-backed obligations instead. Their wartime bets had been transformed into guaranteed returns, underwritten by the full taxing power of the American state. This was the great transfer. Losses that would have destroyed individual institutions were spread across the entire population. The risks of foreign war finance, once concentrated among a small financial elite, were now carried by farmers, workers, and families who had never voted for war in the first place. Meanwhile, the federal government grew at an unprecedented pace. New bureaucracies emerged, new powers were normalized, income tax rates rose sharply, permanently altering the relationship between citizens and the state. War finance became a template. For the first time, the United States demonstrated how modern conflicts would be paid for, not by kings or merchants risking their own fortunes, but by entire populations bound to long-term debt. And the war did not merely reshape American finance, it reshaped the global system. With European economies devastated and deeply indebted, the United States emerged not just as a military power, but as the world's central creditor. Gold flowed inward, capital markets shifted westward. New York began to replace London as the financial heart of the world. The dollar, once secondary to the pound, was moving toward dominance, but victory came at a price that would not be paid immediately, because the debt structure built during the war did not dissolve when the guns fell silent. It remained quietly accumulating interest, quietly reshaping incentives, quietly setting the stage for the next crisis, and that crisis would arrive sooner than anyone expected. In early 1917, British intelligence intercepted a coded diplomatic message sent by Germany's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, to the Mexican government. The proposal was blunt and desperate. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico would be offered financial support and the promise of reclaimed territory in the American Southwest in exchange for joining the conflict. From a strategic perspective, the message was reckless. Germany was already overstretched and searching for any possible leverage to deter American intervention, but on its own. The telegram was not a declaration of war, it was a contingency plan, a gamble made by a power running out of options. British intelligence understood something crucial. The telegram was not most valuable as information. It was valuable as timing. Rather than releasing it immediately, Britain waited. When the moment was right, when American financial exposure had peaked and political pressure was aligned, the message was handed to Washington and then leaked to the press. Headlines exploded across the country. The abstract horrors of a distant European war were suddenly reframed as a direct threat to American soul. For President Wilson, the Zimmerman telegram was the missing piece. It provided the moral pretext needed to go before Congress. But the pretext alone does not move a population that has been committed to peace for years to turn reluctance into enthusiasm. Something far more powerful was required, a machine. Once the decision to enter the war was made, at the highest levels, the United States launched one of the most aggressive and coordinated propaganda campaigns in modern history. The effort was centralized under the Committee on Public Information, commonly known as the Creel Committee. Its mission was simple: reshape reality. The enemy was to be dehumanized, the war was to be sanctified, doubt was to be eliminated. Newspapers, already dependent on advertising revenue from war-related industries, fell into line almost immediately. Stories portraying German soldiers as barbaric monsters flooded the press. Tales of atrocities, many later proven to be exaggerated or fabricated, were repeated until they became accepted truth. The conflict was no longer framed as a geopolitical struggle, it became a moral crusade. Propaganda reached into every corner of American life. The government recruited over 75,000 4-minute men, volunteers, who delivered short, scripted speeches in movie theaters, churches, factories, and town halls. Early Hollywood joined the effort, producing films that depicted Germany as a monstrous threat to civilization itself. Posters covered walls and storefronts, urging loyalty, silence, and sacrifice. Questioning the war was framed as betrayal. Soon, it became criminal. The Espionage Act and the Sedition Act were passed, effectively outlawing criticism of the government, the draft, or the war effort. Dissenters were arrested, newspapers were shut down, speech was policed. In a matter of months, the psychological landscape of the country was transformed. The nation that had re-elected Wilson on a promise of peace was remade into a nation prepared for total war. With public opinion secured or suppressed, President Wilson went to Congress. The declaration of war followed, and with it, the gates of finance were thrown wide open. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world expected a return to normalcy. Soldiers went home, factories slowed, parades filled the streets. The war, people believed, was over. Financially, it had barely begun. Europe emerged from the conflict shattered not only physically, but structurally. Britain and France had won the war, yet they were effectively bankrupt. Their economies had been hollowed out, their currencies weakened, and their treasuries drained. What remained was a towering wall of debt, most of it owed to a single reminder of wartime salvation. The United States, Washington now faced a choice. It could forgive the debts, acknowledging that the loans had been made under extraordinary circumstances, or it could insist on repayment, treating wartime finance as a binding commercial obligation. The decision was unforgiving. The United States demanded full repayment, principal and interest. This choice locked the global economy into a fatal loop. Britain and France did not possess the gold or trade surpluses needed to pay America. Their only realistic source of funds was Germany, which had been assigned massive reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. The logic appeared clean on paper. Germany would pay France and Britain. France and Britain would pay the United States. The circle would close. In reality, it was an economic trap. Germany's economy was already broken. Its industrial base had been damaged. its political system destabilized, and its currency under pressure to meet reparation demands. Berlin turned to the printing press. The result was hyperinflation, a collapse so extreme that savings were wiped out, wages became meaningless, and social trust disintegrated. But even hyperinflation did not generate the foreign currency needed to service international debts, so the system adapted. American banks began lending to Germany. The loans allowed Germany to pay reparations. Those reparations allowed Britain and France to pay the United States. The money flowed in a perfect circle, originating in New York, passing through Berlin, Paris, and London, and returning home with interest. It was financial alchemy. And it was completely unsustainable. The stability of the entire post-war world now depended on continuous American lending. As long as capital flowed outward, the system held. The moment it stopped, everything would unravel. This arrangement did more than preserve debt, it postponed collapse. Political leaders congratulated themselves. Markets rallied. A fragile illusion of recovery settled over the 1920s. But beneath the surface, the structure was brittle, the debts were too large, the growth was too artificial, the margin for error was razor thin. The war had ended, the financial war had not, and when confidence finally cracked, the consequences would not be confined to Europe. They would hit the entire world at once. The system only worked as long as American capital kept moving outward. That was the unspoken rule holding the post-war world together. Germany needed loans to pay reparations. Britain and France needed reparations to pay their debts. And the United States needed everyone else to keep paying, so its banks and treasury could pretend the wartime gamble had been resolved. For a few years, it held. The 1920s were sold as a decade of recovery and optimism. Stock markets surged, credit expanded, consumption exploded. To the public, it looked like prosperity. To financiers, it looked like momentum. But underneath, the structure was hollow. American banks were lending not because Europe was productive, but because Europe was obligated. Loans were not financing growth, they were financing payments. Each new dollar of credit was required just to keep the system from collapsing under the weight of the previous one. This was not recovery, it was extension. By the late 1920s, cracks began to appear. The Federal Reserve, concerned about speculation and inflation at home, started tightening credit. Interest rates rose, liquidity dried up. What seemed like a minor policy adjustment in New York rippled outward across the entire global system. Then the loans slowed. Germany felt it first, as American capital retreated. German banks lost access to fresh dollars. Reparations payments wobbled. Currency pressure returned. Confidence evaporated. A banking crisis erupted, followed by mass unemployment and political chaos. With Germany unable to pay, Britain and France were trapped. They still owed the United States, but their only source of funds had disappeared. Trade contracted, budgets imploded. Governments faced impossible choices between default and domestic collapse. The circle had broken. In 1929, the illusion finally shattered in the United States itself. The stock market crash was not the cause of the crisis, it was the signal. Credit ceased, banks failed, international lending froze completely. What had been postponed for a decade arrived all at once. The Great Depression spread across borders with ruthless efficiency. World trade collapsed, industrial output plunged entire. Societies were thrown into desperation. The debts that had once been treated as sacred obligations became unpayable abstractions overnight, and with economic collapse came political consequences. In Germany, the humiliation of reparations, the destruction of savings, and mass unemployment created fertile ground for extremism. In the United States, faith in markets and institutions was shaken. Across Europe, democracies weakened as populations searched for order at any cost. This was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system built on deferred losses and political denial. The war had been financed without confronting its true cost. The reckoning had simply been delayed and magnified. By the time leaders recognized the scale of the failure, it was too late to unwind peacefully. The world would not truly escape the financial architecture of World War I until it was destroyed and rebuilt by an even larger catastrophe, another war. World War I did more than redraw borders. It rewired how power, money, and war interact. Before 1914, wars were constrained by finance. Governments depended on gold reserves, taxation, or wealthy patrons. When money ran out, wars ended or collapsed. The cost of conflict imposed a natural limit. World War I broke that limit. For the first time, a major war was financed primarily through debt issued to the public, underwritten by central banks, and justified through mass propaganda. The state learned that it did not need to possess wealth to wage war, it only needed the authority to borrow against the future. This was the real revolution. Liberty bonds were not a historical anomaly. They were a proof of concept. They showed that entire populations could be mobilized not just militarily, but financially. Risk could be hidden, losses could be delayed, and accountability could be diffused across generations. After the war, this model did not disappear, it became doctrine. Central banks gained unprecedented influence. Government debt markets became permanent. War, once limited by fiscal reality, was now limited only by political and narrative control. The interwar collapse did not discredit the system, it refined it. By World War II, governments applied the same framework with greater sophistication. Debt was larger, propaganda was tighter, central bank coordination was deeper, and when the war ended, the architects ensured the system would not collapse again in the same way. The result was Bretton Woods. The dollar replaced gold as the anchor of the global system. American debt became the world's reserve asset. Trade, security, and finance were fused into a single structure, one that allowed deficits to grow without immediate consequence. At the center stood the United States, no longer just a nation, but a financial engine. The lesson learned from World War I was not restraint, it was scalability. Debt could fund dominance. Crises could be postponed, and when pressure built too high, it could be released through controlled inflation, restructuring, or geopolitical conflict. This is why modern wars look the way they do. This is why financial crises are managed, not resolved. This is why debt never truly disappears, it is rolled, expanded, and normalized. The system born in 1917 still governs the world. And like all systems built on deferred costs, it carries an expiration date. The question is not if it breaks, it is who pays when it does.